Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a returning guest, David D. Clarke, MD. He's the president of the Psychophysiologic Disorders Association. He's been on before. We've had a lot of great conversations. I think he's got fantastic insights. Today we're going to talk about the opioid crisis and, again, the PBD awareness, psychophysiologic disorders. What are they, just as a refresher, and how do they work? So welcome back, David.
Great to be with you, Richard. Thank you.
For people that haven't listened to the other interview we did, let's start out. What are PBDs, first of all?
Yeah, it's a good abbreviation for a real mouthful of a term. But basically, the idea is that your brain can cause real symptoms in your body: chronic pain, all kinds of different illnesses from head to toe that are absolutely real. These are not in your head. These are every bit as real as organ diseases and structural damage. They can go on for years or even decades. They can put you in the hospital. They can happen to absolutely anybody. In fact, they happen even more often in my practice to people that are above average in their ability to handle stress. But it turns out that's why your brain is doing this to you. It's because of stress in your life, which surprisingly often can be a long-term impact of adversity when you were a child. If you were treated in a way that you would never want a child of your own to be treated, for example, that can have long-term impacts on personality traits, unrecognized emotions, triggers that are going on in the present day that are capable of impacting your brain, changing its wiring, changing the processing of signals from the body, and producing significant levels of illness, as I say, from head to toe. The good news about all this is that even though it afflicts 40% of people who go to the doctor, there is newly available excellent treatment for this in the form of pain relief psychology that my nonprofit is teaching everybody that we possibly can to learn how to do. EndChronicPain.org is the place to go if you want to learn more about this.
Yeah, I guess this is a good response to, the gaslighting I've heard many, many times. Other people's experiences by the medical industry. Oh, it's all in your head. Well, a significant portion is, it sounds like, but not all of it. But the PBD seems to be a big part of this, a valid response to that.
Yeah, it's about 40% of people. And, it's not in your head, because that implies that, you're imagining this, that, you're somehow mentally weak or neurotic and there's nothing we can do for you. And none of those assumptions is true. I mean, the symptoms are real. They happen because people are under way more stress than they recognize. And we've got great treatment for it.
Yeah, years ago, I remember they used to talk about people having a nervous breakdown. What's the equivalent of that today, and what would it be called?
I think that's still a term that a lot of people would use. I think that in the healthcare profession, we tend not to use it as much. And it basically refers to somebody who's coping with so much from past or present that they really can't function in their day-to-day lives. And, very often they're going to need inpatient care for some period of time. It doesn't happen very often. In my patients with psychophysiologic disorders, I can remember one patient who just became overwhelmed when I started asking her about past stress in her life. She was a sexual abuse survivor, and just even asking a couple of simple questions about stresses from her childhood was too much for her, and she spent the next 30 days inpatient psychiatric facility. But she stands out in my practice, over the last 40 years and 7,000 patients because of that breakdown. Most of the rest of my patients, they're stronger than average mentally, I have to say. And once we uncover these issues and start talking about them and start treating them, they do very well.
Do you think, it's not your fault certainly, but do you think there's a survivorship bias, and that's why your patients appear to be more mentally stronger, because the ones that just gave up and blew up, they never got to you, they never knew that you existed?
I'm sure that's true. People who are being overwhelmed by high levels of stress can resort to a lot of risky behaviors, let's put it that way. I mean, some of them sell their bodies for money. Others are doing dangerous drugs. Others are engaging in risky behaviors like unsafe driving or, in some cases, high-risk athletic activity. Others develop eating disorders or cutting behavior or are not careful about safe sex. I mean, there's a lot of ways that stress generated in childhood can lead to coping behaviors that are not safe for people.
Let's turn the focus to opioids. So what's been your interaction with opioids and the fallout from them? Do you have a lot of patients that have become addicted and having problems? Like, how have you run into it?
Yeah, it was more of an issue in the 90s and the early 2000s for me, because there was a push that turns out to have been generated by the pharmaceutical companies that were selling opioid products, but there was a push to treat pain with opioids and try to eliminate pain with opioids. And, it really doesn't work. The opioids are only a short-term solution. And when people started discovering that, they began to try to wean their patients from these. But by then, there was a habituation that had taken place, and a lot of people started looking for replacement for the prescriptions substances by getting opioids off the street, and that clearly led to a spike in opioid deaths. And then we got hit with fentanyl, which is incredibly potent, 50 times as strong as heroin, 100 times as strong as morphine. One study showed that about 40% of the illegal opioid tablets out there on the street have a lethal dose of fentanyl in it.
What percentage did you say?
40%.
Jeez.
Yeah. I mean, you don't need very much fentanyl. I mean, a couple of milligrams is enough to kill you.
I'll give you a quick, interesting insight. I interviewed a guy that he does crime scene cleanup. And he said a couple of the people in the industry have been killed when there was fentanyl present. It had gotten on their skin as part of the cleanup and they died. So he said whenever they suspect that there's drug use involved in a crime scene, they have to go in and test first because it's very dangerous for anyone even to clean it up.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. I'm not an expert on that particular end of it, the forensics, but I can tell you that a teaspoon of fentanyl has about 2,500 lethal doses in it. So it's incredibly potent. And there's an even more potent one out there called carfentanil, which I think, fortunately, hasn't made it to the streets in anywhere near the quantities. But the fentanyl alone is just spiking the opioid deaths. I mean, I think we had last year 110,000 total drug overdose deaths, and 75 or 80% of them were related to opioids, and a majority of those were street opioids. So it's, you compare that with the number of motor vehicle deaths, for example, or firearm deaths, and it's bigger than both of those combined. The number one killer of people between the ages of 19 and 49 is opioids right now in the United States.
Also, too, the way now it seems like the pendulum has swung possibly too far the other way. I have some family members that, one had a surgery and they gave you, hydrocodone pills, and then they're like, all right, that's it, no more. And, it's not something you could start taking and then just stop. You have to really taper, from what I've seen, the dose, and even that's hard to do. And so the way that they're given out now, I would think it would drive people to seek it illegally, because if you're cut off all of a sudden, what do? Now that you're addicted.
Yeah, tapering is absolutely the way to go. You don't want to throw somebody who's been taking opioids for a period of time and out onto the street with nothing. I mean, you want to make sure that they don't have a withdrawal experience if they've been taking those opioids for a period of time. Absolutely. But it's also true that, a lot of post-surgical pain can be managed without opioids using drugs like ibuprofen. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs can be enough for a large number of people who are, post-operative, for example. So that avoids the whole opioid issue from the start.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
So how do you counsel people that need opioids or are on opioids? Like, at what stage will people come to you for help?
Well, what happens in my practice is people are experiencing pain and sometimes a non-pain condition like dizziness or diarrhea. There's a whole range of non-pain symptoms that can come about from the brain doing this to the body and in turn from stress doing it to the brain. But if there's a pain issue and a person is taking opioids, I'm not going to change their opioid dose right off the top. What I'm going to do is try to do a complete assessment of the patient, which usually the assessment for the organ diseases and the structural damage has already been done. And in my practice, typically not enough has been found to account for the patient's pain. So what other doctors are asking me to do is to find out if the person is struggling with enough stress that it could be causing this very real pain that they have. And typically that's exactly what I find, that they've had an adverse childhood experience or a series of them that has had a long-term impact, as I mentioned earlier, on personality traits, on buried emotions, on triggers, or they have stress that's going on in their life right now, or they have both. And if we can bring those into a conscious awareness, we can start working on them and start reducing the stressful impact they have on the patient. And then as we're making progress with that, then we can start the weaning of the opioids because their pain is going to be getting better. Now, there's a lot of variability in how fast the pain improves. One of my patients had pain for 55 years. And he was completely pain-free in 30 days. So that's, the good end of the spectrum. Another patient had been ill for probably 6 or 7 years. She was taking quite a bit of opioids, and we had to very slowly wean her down. And even after 6 years, we had only gotten it down by about 50%. But she was a very severely afflicted woman, and it was just going to take some time.
What are some typical doses of opioids that are, that you've seen aren't dangerous? And what are some doses where it's getting into a danger zone?
Well, let's talk about morphine because that's kind of the basic. And 5 or 10 milligrams of morphine is going to be enough to alleviate the pain of a fractured leg, for example. So if you were in a car accident, your femur, the long bone of your leg was broken, and you come into the emergency room, you're probably going to get 5 or 10 milligrams of morphine, depending on how big you are and how much you may have taken in the way of opioids in the past. And you're probably going to get a prescription for some kind of opioid for at least a short period of time while you recover. So, those kinds of doses for a short period of time are not going to be an issue. When you're getting up above 100 milligrams of equivalent to morphine, and you can Google this and find out, what other drugs are equivalent to morphine at that level. Then you're talking about, potential for affecting your attention level, your reflexes, and potential for developing an inadvertent overdose. So I'm, very uncomfortable with people taking those kind of amounts. And, it's even worse if you're taking other drugs as well, like anti-anxiety medications, can have an additive effect here. But that's, where I'm starting to talk to people about weaning down. And I'm also, again, to do a complete assessment, I want to find out if there's a stress that's contributing to their pain, because that's the key here. So many of these patients do have exactly that, a major life stress, past or present, or both, that's contributing here. We uncover that, we treat that, we help to alleviate the impact of stress on them, and then we can start the tapering.
I know everyone's different, but if you look at it from, let's say, the 80-20, what is a large majority of people, and what's their situation, a sample one that you see very common? What's a common situation for people that have an opioid issue when they come to you? What does it look like and sound like?
Typically, again, the opioids are given for pain. So this is somebody who's in chronic pain, and there isn't a clear-cut biological reason for that pain. Certainly if you've got a tumor in one of the vertebral bones of your spine, or if you've got a chronically swollen and inflamed pancreas, which is one of the organs of digestion, those are painful. And we're not going to be alleviating that just by talking to you about your stress. But the patients that are referred to me, typically, there doesn't seem to be an adequate biological explanation for why they're having pain. And what other doctors are asking me to do is find out, okay, is there a stress? And that's what I'm looking for. And it can be, almost anything. The full range of human experience can come into play here. I'm just trying to think some of the more extreme examples that I've had. But one of my patients was hospitalized at a major university 4 times a year for 15 years with no diagnosis. And she was having, attacks of illness that would put her in the hospital all these times. And it turned out all the attacks were triggered by interactions with her abusive mother, who was still mistreating her at the age of 50. Mom was in her 70s, patient was 50, and Mom had been verbally and emotionally abusing her since she was 3 or 4 years old. There was, huge psychological tension and stress in that relationship, to the point where when there was an interaction between the two of them, it would trigger a physical illness. I told the story of that patient. It was the very first story in my first book called They Can't Find Anything Wrong. But that patient was successfully treated once I was able to show her that, hey, it's your mom that's doing this to you. And she didn't know. It was completely out of her consciousness that it was her mother who was triggering these events. And, a dozen specialists at this major university, which shall remain nameless to protect the guilty, they didn't look into this. They didn't do a complete evaluation by investigating her for childhood and present-day stress, and of which she had both in spades. And even a psychiatrist at this institution completely missed it because, he determined that she didn't have any psychiatric diagnoses, but he didn't know the kinds of stresses to look for that can make a person physically ill. So there's not really a typical patient that comes in. It's just that they don't have a definite cause for their pain, and we need to go looking for the stress. The really severely pain patients almost always have something from their childhood that is carrying on. My very first patient, going all the way back to the 1980s, her father raped her hundreds of times prior to the age of 12. That's a shocking thing to hear. I was in the 8th year of my medical training. I'd never heard anything like that. I hadn't even been taught to look for something like that. It just came out while we were talking about stress. And she had only told her husband about this. No one else in her life knew. But it was clearly connected to her illness. I was aware of a psychiatrist at UCLA where I was in training that was skilled in helping people with this. That patient was cured in less than 3 months. It just blew my mind that you could alleviate a serious physical condition like that patient had just by talking to them. And chronic pain is amenable to this. If we find the real cause, we can treat it. And there are gold standard science now, in just the last couple of years, randomized controlled trials using pain relief psychology, comparing it with all kinds of different control groups, and the pain relief psychology is knocking it out of the park. It's so much better than the older forms of treatment, which was all that we had until the last few years.
Well, how do most people start on opioids? Is it that they fall down or have an accident, they go to the hospital, they get prescribed, and that's how they start? Or do they just, have they heard that it'll alleviate pain and they self-medicate?
It's usually not a self-medication. Most of the time it starts with a prescription. and the doctors get uncomfortable after a while. I'm refilling the prescriptions indefinitely, especially for somebody whose pain doesn't have a clear-cut explanation. It often does start with what we call acute pain from an injury, and a lot of people who have a psychophysiologic process going on, who have a stress-related pain, that acute pain from the injury can carry on even after the original injury has healed. So it goes from pain, yes, from an injury originally or a car accident or something of that nature. And then, most of the time injuries like that are going to heal in 6 or 8 weeks or so. But in patients with stress-related pain, it doesn't stop. It keeps on going long after the original injury has healed. And for doctors that are not familiar with PPD, this is baffling. It's like, why is this pain going on? Things have healed. Things should have healed. Why am I refilling the opioids for this person when their original injury should long ago have been over? So they get uncomfortable with it and they say, look, we're going to take you off these things. And the patient still has pain, and there's no evaluation for the stress that is responsible for their ongoing pain. So the patient is left with two options: to continue their pain with no treatment, or to continue their pain and go look for something on the street to help them out.
You also said that you've dealt with like 7,000 plus patients over 40 years. What kind of trends and changes have you seen in people and how they deal with pain, how they deal with stress and all that? Is there still high resilience? Is there a loss of resilience? Like, what are you seeing?
My patients are some of the most admirable people that I know. I think of them like Olympic champion weightlifters who are being asked to carry 50 pounds more than the world record for their weight class. If you take an Olympic champion weightlifter and you put 50 pounds more than the world record on their shoulders, their bodies are going to break down. They're going to feel weak. They're going to have, pain in their muscles and bones from this. And it's all because of the weight that they're being asked to carry. And this is, exactly what my patients are dealing with. They are trying to carry a level of stress that would bring any of us to our knees, and many of us to our knees with a lot less stress than my patients are carrying. The difficulty is that they've been carrying this stress for so long that they don't realize the magnitude of it. They don't recognize how huge it is. So many of my patients, when I ask them my routine question, were you under stress as a child? And they'll say, no, not really. Nothing worse than anybody else went through. But then I'll ask them to, get a little more specific about what it was they went through that was no worse than anybody else. And they'll start telling me some incredible things that they went through, incredibly bad things that they went through that are much worse than most people have to cope with. But none of us has a parallel life to compare ourselves with, and my patients certainly don't. So when they look back, it just seems like, it happened. I dealt with it. I've moved on. I don't think it's affecting me anymore. So what I'll do then is I'll ask them, all right, imagine your own kid growing up exactly as you did, and you're a butterfly on the wall of your childhood home, and you're watching your child try to deal with everything you had to deal with. What is that going to be like for you? Are you going to be saying, oh, this isn't that bad? My kid should be able to cope with this. And it's at that point that patients often get a look of horror on their faces, recognizing that they wouldn't want their kid in that environment for 5 minutes, let alone a week. And that helps them to see the reality of that level of weight they've been carrying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Again, have you seen a big change in people, especially since, let's say, COVID or, just, again, over the decades, or are they still kind of the same?
I still see a couple of patients a month. Mostly I'm teaching full-time and running the Psychophysiologic Disorders Association, but the issues are very much the same. I'm searching through my mental data bank of patients that I've seen since I closed my practice about 15 years ago. And, the issues are very much the same. Lately I've been seeing patients who are at the very highest end of educational and business and academic achievement. These are people with very high IQs who have done tremendous things in the academic world or the business world, and it doesn't insulate them from the exact same kinds of stresses I've seen throughout my career.
So what's the future of PPD and its intersection with opioids? what new things are coming, or is it now just a matter of training as many healthcare practitioners as possible to help people in the right way?
Yeah, if we can make training in pain relief psychotherapy a routine for both medical professionals and mental health professionals, so can both be on the same page. They can collaborate with each other. They can trade patients back and forth as needed and get treatment for the whole patient. Then the need for opioids is going to be significantly reduced. We're going to be replacing the ineffective pain management of opioids with the highly effective pain management of pain relief psychology. And again, this is in people that don't have an organ disease, don't have a structural damage as the cause for their pain, that the pain is being generated by the brain, and which is every bit as severe, as I've mentioned, as pain from any other cause. But for the very large number of people where the brain is generating their pain, we've got a vastly better therapeutic option available.
One last thing, we discussed offline the concept of moral injury. So the example I gave is, let's say you were a prostitute for 10 years and, now you've stopped and you want to have a normal relationship. It may be very difficult because of what you put yourself through. Do you see that people that take opioids, do you see that they suffer moral injury? Are they labeled as addicts? Do they feel bad about themselves, that they're weak or bad because they've gotten sucked into this? And how does that all boil into the pot of stew in their head?
Yeah, I think that's a key idea to address, that many of my patients who suffered adversity as children, there is, a tremendous emotional harm that comes out of that, often emotional chaos, often very low self-esteem, a lack of ability to take care of your own needs or spend any time for your own joy. And just the long-term pain from that often leads people into coping strategies that the rest of society finds shameful for one reason or another. And the patients themselves, because, that's society's attitude, they internalize that attitude, that if they're engaging in drug use or prostitution or alcohol abuse, or they have a gambling problem, or an eating disorder or cutting behavior, or promiscuity, even if it's not for payment, just, having one partner after another, all of those things that society regards as shameful are, in fact, just people trying to cope with deep levels of stress that they don't fully appreciate in themselves. So if they can recognize that these behaviors that are regarded as shameful were simply coping strategies for overwhelming amounts of stress, often from the past, then that reduces the shame, and in my mind, it should reduce the shame to zero, because all you were doing was trying to survive. If somebody climbs Mount Everest and comes back from that having frostbitten fingers, we don't tell them they should be ashamed of themselves. We admire them for having climbed Mount Everest. And that's exactly what my patients have done. They have climbed their personal Mount Everest just to survive the experiences they've been through. I mean, imagine, that my first patient with the hundreds of sexual assaults by her own father, what a moral Mount Everest that was to climb out of. And anything that she did along the way to cope with that should not be regarded as shameful. It was just something that helped her survive. And if you reframe it in that way, that's the best way I know to reduce that sense of moral injury.
Well, very good. What do you see as the future of this type of care, over the next few years? What's the most important things that could happen that would really help the most people?
Number one is for everybody to understand and have it be a basic assumption and knowledge meme that everybody has, that your brain can cause pain or illness anywhere in your body with symptoms that are completely real. And if everybody understands that, then it's going to naturally lead to people getting evaluated for that. If you're having pain or illness and there's no clear organ disease or structural damage, it's going to naturally turn everybody's attention to what's going on in the brain. And from there, we're going to be asking, okay, what's the stress? If your brain is doing this to you, what is the stress that has caused this? Is it from the past? Is it from adversity in childhood? Is it a stress going on right now? And if we make those two simple changes, it will revolutionize the care of chronic pain and non-structural illness worldwide. And it's 1 out of every 5 people that suffers from this. It's 80% bigger than the diabetic population. The pain relief psychology is almost like discovering insulin, except that nobody's using it yet. So what I'm hoping to see in the next, the rest of this decade is a massive shift in how people understand this.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And the work you're doing is really, really amazing. How can people find out more and, either get in touch or get learning resources from you? Where can they go?
Yeah, endchronicpain.org is the simplest URL to remember. And we've got a really great 12-item self-assessment quiz on there that I spent hours and hours working on. It's got educational information built into it. The more of those 12 questions to which you answer yes, the more likely it is that your pain or illness is connected to the psychophysiologic disorders. And we've got tons of resources on there, especially for people who choose to support us as dues-paying members. We give tons of discounts to our courses and conferences, and we've got an online course that's free for people who are members. And that's just the beginning. We've got links to resources from people that practice the way we do all across the country.
Well, very good, David. Thank you for coming back on the podcast. It's always good to speak to you, and I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure as always.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.